Before the news, there was the waiting. And before the waiting, there was a strange, electric quiet that hummed beneath the surface of the city. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, New York City was a great sieve, holding its breath. The city that never slept was caught in a moment of profound, collective insomnia, a shared, unspoken anxiety that permeated the humid June air. The graveyard shift workers, their faces pale under the factory lights in Brooklyn and Queens, felt it as they assembled the very ships and planes now engaged in some unknown, titanic struggle an ocean away. The milkmen, their glass bottles clinking in the unnatural stillness of the Manhattan streets, felt it. Even the air itself seemed charged, humming with a terrible and magnificent secret that the Atlantic Ocean was struggling to keep. For months, everyone knew it was coming. They called it the Second Front. They called it the invasion. It was a vast, abstract concept, a promise whispered by Roosevelt and Churchill in fireside chats, a snarling threat from Hitler broadcast on crackling shortwave radios. But on this morning, the abstraction was becoming terrifyingly, seismically real. As the first, pale grey light of dawn began to silhouette the Art Deco spires of the skyscrapers, the first and second waves of American troops were already fighting for their lives on the blood-soaked sands of the Normandy coast. Young men from the Bronx and Staten Island, boys who had learned to swim in the murky waters of the Hudson, were now struggling through the cold, red-tinged waves of the English Channel, under a sky torn apart by the relentless, mechanical rip of German machine gun fire. They were fighting and dying on beaches with strange, new, and soon-to-be-hallowed code names: Omaha, Utah. But in New York, 3,000 miles away, there was still only the quiet. Then, the quiet broke. It broke not with a bang, but with a crackle of static. In kitchens across the 5 boroughs, radios that had been murmuring early morning music or farm reports suddenly fell silent. In diners from the Bowery to Harlem, the clatter of plates and morning chatter ceased as patrons turned their heads towards the speaker on the wall. An announcer's voice, tight with a mixture of awe and barely contained gravity, cut through the calm, reading the first terse communiqué from the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. The words were clipped, military, precise, and yet they carried the thunderous weight of destiny. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. That was it. That was the spark. And the city ignited in a shockwave of ink, electricity, and raw human emotion. At the offices of the Daily News, the colossal printing presses, which had been standing by like sleeping giants, roared to life. The headline was not nuanced or subtle. It was a primal scream in bold black lettering 2 inches high, a headline meant to be read from across a crowded street: Invasion begins. At the New York Times, editors who had been up all night, subsisting on stale coffee and pure adrenaline, rushed to put out a special 6 a.m. edition. The newsboys, their canvas bags stuffed with what felt like the most important papers of their young lives, hit the subway stations and street corners like a charge of cavalry, their voices cracking as they shouted the one word that was on everyone's lips: Invasion, invasion, read all about it. They've landed in France. In Times Square, the incandescent heart of the city, the great electronic news ticker on the New York Times building, a mechanical oracle that had spelled out the fall of empires and the rise of nations for decades, flickered to life. The white letters began their slow, deliberate, inexorable crawl across the black background, materializing out of the morning haze. It was happening. It was real. What followed was a slow, organic, and profound transformation of the city's very soul. The normal, frantic, self-absorbed rhythms of a Tuesday morning simply dissolved. Men on their way to work, their minds full of deadlines and stock prices, stopped dead in their tracks, their briefcases forgotten at their sides. Women out for their morning shopping, their heads full of ration coupons and grocery lists, paused, their mundane errands suddenly feeling trivial and absurd. A human current began to flow from all directions, drawn by an invisible gravity towards the city's nexuses of information and faith. New York was no longer a collection of 8 million individual stories. For these 24 hours, it was a single, unified entity, its collective heart beating in time with the news from a distant, unknown shore. Times Square became the city's public square, its open-air cathedral of anxious information. By mid-morning, the area was packed, a vast, undulating sea of upturned faces, a mosaic of hope and fear. Office workers leaned out of high windows, their ties flapping in the breeze, trying to get a better view. Soldiers on leave and sailors on shore, their crisp white hats like islands in the crowd, stood shoulder to shoulder with businessmen in suits and factory workers in their grease-stained overalls. They didn't speak much. There was nothing to say. They simply watched. They watched the ticker, craning their necks, their eyes scanning the moving letters for any new detail, any name of a town, any hint of progress or peril. A name like Cherbourg would appear, and a murmur would ripple through the crowd, sending some rushing to nearby bookstores to buy an atlas, to put a pin in the map, to make the geography of sacrifice real. Two sailors, their faces etched with an apprehension that only those in uniform could truly understand, leaned against a storefront, a single cigarette burning forgotten between their fingers, their eyes locked on the latest bulletins. They knew what those terse reports really meant. They knew the screams, the chaos, and the smell of blood that were hidden behind the sanitized military language. They were probably looking for the name of a ship or a division number, a small clue to the fate of their friends. Standing nearby might be a soldier on leave, a man who had trained with the very units now storming those beaches. For him, this was a special kind of hell. The guilt of safety, the desperate, gnawing need to be there with his brothers, and the absolute powerlessness of being an ocean away. But where Times Square was a cacophony of nervous energy, other parts of the city sought a different, deeper kind of connection. As the news spread, a quiet pilgrimage began. In churches and synagogues across Manhattan, from the Gothic grandeur of St. Patrick's Cathedral to the small, humble neighborhood shuls in the Lower East Side, people bowed their heads. They weren't just praying for an abstract victory. They were praying for survival. They were praying for the sons, the husbands, the brothers, the sweethearts whose names they whispered into the hallowed silence. In many homes across the city, a small banner with a blue star hung in the front window, a quiet declaration that a loved one was serving overseas. On this day, every blue star seemed to tremble, imbued with a new and terrifying vulnerability. The unspoken fear in every prayer was that the blue star would soon be replaced by a gold one. Vincent de Paul's church on 23rd Street, the noon mass was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the smell of incense, old wood, and the palpable, collective fear of hundreds of souls. A woman in a simple hat knelt in a pew, her head buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling slightly. She wasn't an anonymous member of a crowd. She was the mother of a boy who, just a year ago, was playing stickball on this very street. A boy whose last letter home was full of jokes and complaints about the terrible English food. Now, he was somewhere on a beach in France. Her prayer was not for a grand strategy or a famous general. It was a deeply personal, desperate plea sent across 3,000 miles of ocean to a single, beloved soul. Keep him safe. Please, just keep him safe. This search for solace, for a sense of control in a situation of absolute powerlessness, rippled through the city's very institutions. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the frantic, capitalistic chaos of the trading day came to a sudden, complete halt. A bell rang, and for 2 minutes, the masters of the universe, the men who moved markets and built empires, stood in absolute, reverent silence. For 2 minutes, the ticker tape that spelled out fortunes was forgotten, replaced by the silent, crawling letters of the ticker tape in Times Square that was spelling out fates. In Madison Square, the city's fiery and beloved mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, stood on a makeshift stage. The radio station WNYC was holding a D-Day rally, and thousands had gathered, their faces a mixture of patriotic fervor and deep personal anxiety. LaGuardia, like President Roosevelt would later that evening, chose not to give a bombastic speech of defiance, but to lead the city in prayer. His distinctive, high-pitched voice, usually so full of fight and fury, was now softened with a paternal gravity as he spoke to the crowd, and to the thousands more listening at home on their radios. We, the people of the city of New York, send forth our prayers to the Almighty God for the safety and spiritual welfare of every one of you, and humbly petition Him to bring total victory to your arms. As the long, agonizing day wore on, a new kind of frustration began to set in. The desperate, gnawing hunger for information in an almost total information vacuum. The initial communiques were frustratingly vague. The northern coast of France could be anywhere. News was scarce, heavily censored, and painfully slow to arrive. In a strange and telling twist of the information war, American news outlets like CBS World News found themselves in the bizarre position of quoting German radio broadcasts. The enemy, in those first few hours, was the main source of updated, if heavily biased, information. New Yorkers, huddled around their radios, listened to the clipped, authoritative voice of American announcers like Edward R. Murrow, who would then say, "We now take you to a German broadcast, monitored by our listening posts in London." The airwaves would then fill with the guttural, triumphant, and deeply unsettling sound of the enemy, confidently claiming to have repulsed the invasion, to have thrown the Allies back into the sea in a bloody fiasco. It was a form of psychological torture, forcing a hopeful nation to sift through the arrogant propaganda of its mortal enemy for any grain of truth. But New York did not succumb to despair. It channeled its nervous energy into action, into symbolic gestures of solidarity and hope. The call went out for blood donations, and the lines at hospitals and Red Cross centers snaked around the block. This was something tangible, something real that a person could do. You could give a part of yourself, a pint of your own blood, that might, just might, end up in the veins of a wounded soldier on a field hospital in Normandy. At a French school in Manhattan, young children, some of them Jewish refugees who had narrowly escaped the Nazi occupation of their homeland, gathered in a schoolyard to salute the French tricolour, their small hands raised in a solemn promise of a liberation they could now almost taste. On First Avenue, at another school, a young girl was photographed, tending to a victory garden. Surrounded by the concrete and steel of the city, she knelt in a small patch of earth, cultivating vegetables and herbs. These war gardens, planted in parks and schoolyards across the country, were more than just a source of food. They were a profound act of faith. Each seed planted was a vote for the future. Each tomato vine tended was a prayer for the day the boys would come home. That evening, the entire nation fell silent once more, this time to listen to the voice of its commander-in-chief, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his voice calm, steady, and reassuring, addressed the American public. Like LaGuardia, he understood that this was not a moment for political speeches. It was a moment for communal prayer. He asked the American people to join him in a prayer he had written himself, asking God to bless the war effort, to give strength to our sons, the pride of our nation, and to grant them victory in their righteous cause. He asked them to continue their prayers in the difficult days to come, acknowledging the terrible cost that this mighty endeavor would demand. As night fell on New York City, the mood had shifted again. The initial shock had given way to a kind of grim, unified resolve. The crowds in Times Square were still there, their numbers swelling as people came from late shifts at work, drawn to the constant, reassuring light of the ticker. The churches remained open, their doors a welcoming portal for anyone seeking a moment of quiet reflection. The city, on that long and fateful day, had transformed. It had become a single, massive prayer meeting, a city-wide vigil. The candid photographs taken on June 6, 1944, capture not just a historical event, but a profound human moment. They show a city holding its collective breath, united in a single, desperate hope. The photos show us that the D-Day invasion was not just fought with bullets and shells on the beaches of Normandy. It was fought in the hearts of the people in Times Square, in the silent prayers whispered in the pews of St. Vincent de Paul's, and in the small, hopeful act of a young girl planting a seed in a victory garden. It was a day that New York, and the world, would never forget.